Okay, I believe we are live. I am having a meeting with myself. Let me pop to full screen here. Okay, good. I'm going to talk about two things: measuring contaminant removal in spaces and then plugging those into standardized risk assessments for infectious aerosol risk. So first off, in healthcare, we often refer to contaminant removal as wait time, i.e. How much time do I need to wait for 90% removal of contaminants? That comes from this CDC table, which is just mechanizations around that equation that you see at the bottom there. The real name of that equation is the room purge equation, and it's very handy for field measurements because I can walk into a room with a particle meter and a can of Aquanet hairspray and contaminate the room and then take a reading and then take another reading 5 minutes later and then calculate the room air change rate based on that. So we've been calling this, the units are air changes per hour, but I think it's a little bit different than just room ventilation number. So we call it the effective air change rate, or the air change rate as measured by the contaminant removal. Then the next tool here is the SEAR, the Standard Environmental Aerosol Risk Calculation. It's a long name, I know, but every word of that is a little bit important. First of all, aerosol generation rates and infectious doses vary from person to person. And so for a comparison, we have to have a standard generation infectious dose that we assume. Second, this is environmental risk, so it doesn't include personal protection, most importantly, masks. And then this is for aerosol risk only. HVAC systems and any of the iterations don't help with droplet or fomites. I also think it's very fair to say that the margin of error on this calculation is 20 to 25%. So if scenario 1 has a 75% risk and scenario 2 has a 50% risk, that's probably worth talking about. If scenario 1 was a 42% risk and scenario 2 was a 38% risk, that's probably not really worth. We should look very skeptically at that. And then as we go through the slides, anything below 10%, you'll see me refer to as just below 10%, right? I'm going to give a bunch of examples, as many as I can squeeze into the time here. Some of these are very high school science project type of things. They're in my house or my office. And then the ones towards the end there are into the hospitals and clinics. First one, this is my son, Dylan's room, and there is one window open providing natural ventilation. The contaminant in this test was CO2 from sublimated dry ice. The measured contaminant removal was 1.2 to 1.9 air changes. So if this room were a ICU patient room and a nurse had a 4-hour exposure time in that room, the standard environmental aerosol risk would be 55 to 70%. Pretty high. This is a classroom at a local school by my house. I did some pro bono work for this local school this year. And in this case, the HVAC unit was running, providing ventilation. The contaminant was CO2 from sublimated dry ice. The measured contaminant removal was 1.5 air changes. So a teacher could go in here and really work a full shift, a 6-hour exposure time, and the standard environmental aerosol risk would be about 25%. This is the same classroom, and in this case, the windows were open. They had natural ventilation windows, so we opened those windows for the natural ventilation effect. The measured contaminant removal was, in this case, 13 to 18 air changes. And so in that event, even at a 6-hour exposure time, the standard environmental aerosol risk is less than 10%. So this is my office. And in my office, we have a central system. It's the office that you're looking at now if you see the camera. The contaminant here was CO2 from baking soda and vinegar, the old science project in high school. But I want to use this one to talk about the curve itself. If you take a look at that curve, and then you compare the curve against the curve that's generated by the room purge equation, you'll notice that it doesn't really line up. In fact, it actually seems to fall into some discrete phases. There's an initial drop-off where this room looks like it has 20 air changes, and then there's this steady decline period where we look more like 2 air changes, and then there's that trailing edge or the sustained contamination period. That last little bit is, frankly, I think needs to be a research topic. We engineers need to know more about that because I fear that we may be making promises in that region that our systems might not actually be able to do. But when we're doing these calculations, we're aiming for that middle portion, the sort of steady decline portion. That's what we're aiming at when we do the calcs. Same office. There's a picture of my office from my point of view. And then in addition to the house system, you'll notice that I have a little desk fan. And this test was with that fan turned off and then on low and then on high. It's an oscillating fan. The contaminant was Aquanet hairspray. The desk fan, turns out, doesn't matter. Measured contamination rates were between 11 and 15 in all cases. So if my office were an exam room with a 20-minute exposure time, the standard environmental aerosol risk would be below 10%. These are some actual exam rooms in Colorado, actually. They've added portable HEPA units ducted out of the room. You can see the pictures up there. And these tests were taken with the fan off and then with the fan on. The contaminant was hairspray. Measured contamination in these rooms was between 9 and 35 air changes. It is kind of interesting to note that this is the same they added to 2 rooms, equal size rooms, but there's a different marginal benefit that you get from it in each case. So these are exam rooms with a 20-minute exposure time. The base ventilation rates in both of these cases was very good, and so in this case, the standard environmental aerosol risk would be below 10% for all of the options. Which is to say that those fans are not providing a significant benefit in terms of environmental risk. This is a COVID screening station. They've added some portable HEPAs ducted out of the rooms. Those tests, and so we did tests with the fan off and then the fan on. The contaminant was hairspray. Removal was between 14 and up to 25 air changes, but I want you to particularly look at that first test and the spike in total contaminant. What happened there was the direction of the air was dragging contaminants from one station to the next and actually making it worse. So we had to reposition the unit. Even for a full shift of exposure time here, those air change rates, even the baseline air change rates, are quite high. So all of these are below 10% standard environmental risk. This is a patient room. There's a HEPA filter added and it's been ducted out of the room. The contaminant that we used to measure this was hairspray. Measured contaminant removal was between 7 and 11 air changes. And so for an ICU nurse, a 4-hour exposure time, the standard environmental aerosol risk would be just above 10% in both cases. So there's not really a significant improvement that happens here, even though the unit looks really good and it's loud. So you feel like you're really getting something out of that. This is a patient room with a HEPA filter added at a ventilated headboard. The ventilated headboard, in this case, bolted to the wall. The contaminant that we use for this smoke machine. This is kind of early on. We were using this theatrical smoke machine. So you can see the measured contaminant removal was between 11 and 22 air changes. For an ICU nurse, the standard exposure risk would be below 10% in both cases. And that's mostly because the normal room ventilation contaminant removal is so high, right? We're already below 10% based on the background ventilation. This is another patient room. There's another HEPA filter added at a ventilated headboard. This is more of a movable ventilated headboard. Actually, the final version had wheels on it. The contaminant, again, was the theatrical smoke machine. We did this test just a day or two later. Measured contaminant removal was between 12 and 35 air changes. But again, you notice that the normal room ventilation is already quite high. And so for an ICU nurse at a 4-hour exposure time, the standard environmental risk went from just above 10% to just below 10%. But really, that's only a 5% change in risk. It's not a really big improvement that happened here. Okay, this one's different. I call this a failed test. We measured contamination in the room and in the hallway. The contaminant was hairspray here, and the measured contaminant removal was between 6 and 17 air changes, which is a significant improvement in the room, but I'm not actually going to talk about that. But in all cases, we saw cross-contamination into the hallway. If you look at those dots, the larger dots are contamination in the room, and then the smaller dots are contamination in the hallway. We were seeing cross-contamination in all events. This is also where we figured out that we were testing these headboards incorrectly. The purpose of those ventilated headboards, like a kitchen hood, is to capture contaminants before they contaminate the room. So you're not really increasing the room ventilation per se, you're decreasing the room contamination is what the goal is. And you can't test that with hairspray because hairspray has velocity. And so once you press down on the hairspray, it really shoots out into the room. And there's nothing that a hood can do to stop that. So we had to figure out a new test procedure. So this is my conference room. And now the contaminant is a residential humidifier that's charged full of salt water. And the salt becomes aerosol particulate matter. So we put a HEPA unit in the room to capture some of the contaminants, and we were able to measure that effect. So in this chart, you can look at the area under the curve during contamination and calculate the difference. And in this case, we were able to calculate that the filter unit captured 40% of the particles before they infected the room, essentially. So then we took that show on the road. This is a patient room with a headboard and a HEPA filter. And the contaminant, again, is salt water in a residential humidifier. And in this case, at 75% speed, this thing captures 100% of the contaminants. So we're cleaning the room faster than we can contaminate the room. Even at 50% speed, we saw an 85% capture rate. And so in this case, for an ICU nurse at a 4-hour exposure time, the standard aerosol environmental risk goes from 25% essentially down to 0, or below 10% for sure. And the change here is the number in red. So what we're doing is we're decreasing the contamination by 90% or 100%, and then that changes the risk that's associated with that. These are a whole bunch of exam rooms that we tested. Nothing added to these exam rooms, so this is just the baseline testing. The contaminant was hairspray. Most of these had 2 to 3 air changes. Some were as high as 6 to 10. There was one surprise in the mix that was less than 1. For exam rooms with that 20-minute exposure time, the standard environmental risk at 1 air change is 20%. At 2 air changes, it drops below 10%. And then beyond there, it's really kind of gravy. And so the additional adds, probably don't provide a significant change in risk. So what's the moral of this story? Well, 15 years ago, I never met anybody who had a particle meter because they cost thousands and thousands of dollars. But now you can buy a wearable particle meter off of Amazon for $80. And so if the goal is to affect contaminant behavior, then we need to really measure contaminant behavior. I think at this point, that's an ethical imperative, right? If we are predicting contaminant behavior, then we should be able to show it coming true with some pretty simple measurements according to our predictions. We certainly have the tools to be able to measure contamination in air. All it takes is a little bit of creativity to think about how you would actually perform a validation study. And I think it's not too difficult, to think about. From what I've seen in the last 6 months, I don't actually know that we have a good set of engineering tools that predict contaminant behavior. I think that's important because if ASHRAE wants to get into the infectious disease business, there's kind of 2 ways you can go there. You can start selling snake oil to scared people, or you can do engineering. And if you want to do engineering, then that means you need to have a predictable, repeatable, measurable effect on the physical environment. And so I think we have a ways to go with that, and we need to do a lot more measurement before we do a lot more writing. End of presentation. Now, if only I can figure out how to stop the recording. There it is, there it is, there it is. stop recording.